Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending 40 weeks of Third Age Thursdays doing deep dives into the poetry and songs from the Lord of the Rings, we finally moved on to something else this series with our look at Middle-earth artifacts of the Third Age. We began with Glamdring and Orcrist, and then spent all of last week talking about Sting. Today, we'll wrap up our time in The Hobbit with a look at the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone. Now, some of this will sound familiar to those of you who listened to Season 2 of the PPP, or even to some of you who've been listening to the TTT since October 2 years ago, when I talked about a little word nerdery on the Arkenstone, which we'll necessarily have to revisit. Still, let's dive back in and look at the great white gem, which the dwarves had found beneath the roots of the mountain, the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone of Thrain. We read in The Hobbit that it was like a globe with 1,000 facets. It shone like silver in the firelight, like water in the sun, like snow under the stars, like rain upon the moon. Later, when Bilbo finds it, we read, "It was the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain." So Bilbo guessed from Thorin's description, but indeed there could not be two such gems, even in so marvelous a hoard, even in all the world. Ever as he climbed, the same white gleam had shone before him and drawn his feet towards it. Slowly it grew to a little globe of pallid light. Now, as he came near, it was tinged with a flickering sparkle of many colors at the surface, reflected and splintered from the wavering light of his torch. At last he looked down upon it, and he caught his breath. The great jewel shone before his feet of its own inner light, and yet, cut and fashioned by the dwarves, who had dug it from the heart of the mountain long ago, it took all light that fell upon it and changed it into 10,000 sparks of white radiance, shot with glints of the rainbow. And some of that description, especially the idea that it shone of its own inner light, have led folks reasonably to wonder if the Arkenstone is a Silmaril. Specifically, the one that accompanied Maedhros as he hurled himself into a fiery chasm. This is where I say, come not to the Man of the West, for he will say both yes and no. It isn't, of course, but it also kind of is. Let me explain. For this, I want to look at The Ring of Words, a book on Tolkien and the OED, written by 3 editors of the OED, and in that we get a close examination of dozens of words used or invented by Tolkien. It is perhaps the most useful single book for Tolkien word nerds and something I highly recommend for your shelf. I know I've referenced it before, but it's been a while, and I really wanted to remind you to add it to your libraries. There, under the entry for Arkenstone, we read that the name is one of many extinct Old English words which Tolkien revived, though he did not simply lift Old English words from their context, but fitted them into their new surroundings by giving them modernized spellings. Those updated spellings, Ring of Words argue, reflect the patterns of change and pronunciation which can be seen in those words which did survive into modern English, so that they have linguistic authenticity, representing the spellings that the extinct words would have had if they had survived in continuous use through the centuries. So what's the Old English word that Tolkien used as the basis for the modern English word Arkenstone? The word was Eorknonstan, meaning precious stone, with Eorknan meaning precious and stan, not surprisingly, meaning stone. Now, the authors of Ring of Words go on to explain this transition to a modernized form by comparing it to another Old English word that has survived into modern English. That word is hearken. They say that Tolkien preferred spelling it without that first E, which the OED says is more regular and of earlier standing. That word hearken, just like the Arken part of Arkenstone, but with the H, comes from Old English Heorknian. And the Ring of Words explains that the last 3 letters, the IAN, are an ending that disappears before modern times, as the AN of Eorknan would have done. The EOR to AR transition, AOR to R, is also a regular transition from Old English to modern English, and so Eorknonstan becomes Arkenstone. But this gets even more interesting, because when Tolkien was writing The Hobbit in the early to mid-1930s, he was also working on, get this, an Old English version of the Annals of Valinor. It's in the Shaping of Middle-earth, which is volume 4 of the History of Middle-earth, and there's frankly not a lot there for us to discuss about this, but there is one thing we do discover. The Silmarils are called Arkenstones, leading the authors of the Ring of Words to conclude that although the Arkenstone has no obvious link to the wider history or mythology of Middle-earth, its name does make a hidden connection with the tales of the elder days. Now, John Ratliff, in The History of the Hobbit, argues that Tolkien intended to make this hidden connection, but also concludes that the connection does not establish that they're the same jewel. And I love the way he puts this. Sean and I talked about this way back in episode 43 of the Prancing Pony podcast. Ratliff writes, by avoiding the use of the word Silmaril, and instead using the ingenious and agreeable synonym Arkenstone, Arkenstone, Tolkien got to draw on his rich homebrew mythology, which by the early 1930s had developed a remarkable depth and sophistication, without worrying what the effect of his new story would be on that mythology. In other words, Tolkien was using his own homebrew mythology as a source of inspiration. So the Arkenstone isn't a Silmaril, but the Silmarils certainly inspired it. One final thing just to wrap this up. In the revised and expanded edition of the Letters, there is a newly published letter 283A written to Dick Plotz. He was the founder of the Tolkien Society of America, which eventually merged with the Mythopoeic Society in 1972. In response to a question about the proper Elvish translation for "May the Silmarils ever light on your path," Tolkien clarifies, one would not ever say this, because only one of the Silmarils is now visible, the one in the ship of Eärendil, the Morning Star. The other two were lost, one in the depths of the sea, the other under the earth, until the end of the world. And that clears that up. Folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we continue the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. Check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, and more. Podcast listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your apps. And for those on YouTube, like and subscribe to the channel to get all of the PPP productions. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.